Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, April Lawson-Cornfield. And I am joined today with two of my favorite young leaders in the organization. Everybody, I'm sure, on this podcast knows Mónica Guzmán. Mónica, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, April. Always good. Always good to see you.
Yes, totally. Salute, yes. And Daniel, you and I have done a fair bit of work together, but I don't know if this is your first time to the podcast or your second time, but it's really great to have you with us.
I believe it's my first time, and thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, we'll try to make it a good one. So as you both know, and as many listeners are aware, I do a series of podcasts, one a month, and what we try to explore primarily is who are the voices that are not well represented in Braver Angels and in the bridging movement more broadly, and what do they have to teach us? What is it that's keeping them out of the room, and what can we learn from them to help bring them in, but also just period about the work that we're doing? And so I appreciate you both being here today as we dive into the question of, here's this word, Latinx, Latino, Latin communities. And actually, before we get into our detailed questions, I'm just going to make a quick note about that, which is I have heard from friends of mine who identify with this community, both that they only prefer Latinx and that they find Latinx actively offensive because it it's an overlay on their language that does not comport with their language. And so for purposes of this podcast, I will probably mostly use the word Latin. And I may slip into the term Latino just because it's the one I'm familiar with. But that's how we're going to deal with this issue for today. With that, I would like to invite each of you to tell us about yourself. And I'm going to start with Daniel because you are a little bit newer to the podcast. And so we want to hear, who are you? What are you about? And in particular, tell us about your family background and just why you got involved with Braver Angels.
Yeah, definitely. So my family background, I was born in Caracas, Venezuela, lived there until about, I want to say 2007, 2008. The timeline always gets muggy there. But moved to the US, moved to Miami with my family after the election. I believe it was in 2006. And then I've been living in the US since. I currently live in Washington, D.C. And how I got involved with Braver Angels actually is while I was an undergrad in college, I met April Lawson and Doug Spry when you contacted AU and you wanted to come and host a Braver Angels debate over on campus. This was, I believe, I want to say fall of 2018, if I'm not mistaken there. I think it was fall 2018. And we ended up hosting a debate on, I believe the resolution was resolved healthcare is a human right. And it ended up being very, very successful and sort of the start of this beautiful partnership. And then since then, I've collaborated with Braver Angels in a variety of different ways, either through the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or through a student organization I used to lead called Students for Free Expression, or just on my own personal capacity, joining different debates that were being hosted in person and Zoom and otherwise. And I think that's a good summary of the background there.
Yeah, that's great. And I always have to brag on my college and youth leaders just a little bit. As soon as we did that debate at AU, which by the way was one of the most powerful we've ever done still, we knew we had found somebody really special in Daniel Acosta-Rivas. And we then managed to woo him into continuing to work with us. And we're very glad that you're still with us. So thank you for that. And Mónica, obviously, these listeners probably know something about you in general, but tell us a little bit about the family part and just sort of anything you want to add regarding who you are and what you're about, particularly vis-a-vis this aspect of your identity.
So I was born in Monterrey, Mexico in 1982. I'm turning 40 this year. And I moved to the States in, it was in the mid 80s. It's in the early 80s. I should know the year, y'all. I was like five or six. So yeah, late 80s. That's it, late 80s. And became a citizen when my parents did in 2000. So they were naturalized and I was 17. So I automatically became a citizen. But I've been in the United States since I first moved here when I was 5 or 6. I remember kindergarten here and still not understanding the language very well. I remember confusing he and him, él y ella, like I kept getting them wrong, and all kinds of things like that. I remember that in 3rd grade, the very last word that I pronounced with a Spanish accent when I spoke English was three, and that disappeared. I stopped rolling my R when I said 3. Yeah. And actually, I remember thinking, even when I was very little, oh, people won't know now. I lived in a small town in New Hampshire for my childhood, most of my childhood in the States. And we were the only Spanish speaking family around. I mean, there wasn't that much. I went to an Irish Catholic school that was, yeah, just all Irish Catholic, mostly white folks, and everyone very fascinated by me. And the principal once had me, well, actually, when I got to the school, she was so impressed that I could count to 100 in English and Spanish that she marched me around all the different classrooms so I could do it, in front of everyone. So I was a novelty. I was quite the novelty. Yeah. And what else to say about my family? So my parents are in North Carolina now. They live close to my brother, and the rest of my extended family is all in Mexico. And we try to visit once every other year, if not more often than that.
Spectacular. Yeah. And I really appreciate that you have sort of already gotten into the thing I was going to ask about next, which is tell us a little bit more about like what it was like growing up. And so you can add anything on that you like. Daniel, I do want to hear though from you, like, what was it like growing up in this kind of context?
Yeah, it was very, I think, interesting is probably a good word for it. Because, I moved to a suburb of Miami called Doral. That legally is its own city and entity, but that's not true. It's just a suburb of Miami. And I was very much surrounded by other like fellow Hispanics that had just moved to the US recently, or their parents had moved and they were born here in the US. And so it was weird because it didn't quite feel like I had left. I mean, I knew for a fact I had left Venezuela. I was different. I was being exposed to a lot of different people who weren't Venezuelan, but I was still very much like surrounded by Hispanics and Latinos. And so that aspect of it was really interesting. But I for some reason, I would make a conscious decision to expose myself to like more American like people. I don't know why. If I just thought it was interesting or I just thought it was different. To the point of where I like a lot of my later friends in high school still in that area would ask me like, oh, like you weren't born in the US because you didn't really have an accent. Like if you learned English as a second language. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, like I was definitely born in Caracas. I lived there until I was like 10 or whatever. But yeah, so it was a very interesting sort of situation. I think one of the biggest culture shocks was so my dad was a journalist back home. And so I was used to him being recognized in the street very regularly. So I think one of the biggest sort of culture shocks was moving somewhere and I'm like, oh, people don't know who my dad is. That's kind of weird. So yeah, it was very interesting. And I did also, funnily enough, I did have a very heavy English accent, or rather I'm like Spanish accent speaking English, right up until like the 4th grade. And I think it had to do with the fact that I somehow got taken out of ESOL classes after less than 1 year. And so I went from not speaking any English, because back in Venezuela, I wouldn't do my English homework because I always told my parents, like, I'm never going to need to speak English. And I was very wrong about that. To, moving to the US and then in less than a year being taken out of ESOL. And all of a sudden I was like, oh man, like now I got to speak English full time. And I would definitely, I think pretty much until I was in like late middle school, I would say instead of 3, I would say 3. Like the concept of the
there we go.
really aligned with me. But yeah, it was a very unique setting, I think, because of how surrounded I was by Hispanics. And that just grew as I got older, and more Hispanics were moving to Miami as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I remember the first time I went to Miami, I wasn't sure I was in the US. Like, people were referring to it as like the capital of Latin America. And when I would speak Spanish, they'd say like, oh, like, where are you from? Because you're in the wrong neighborhood, honey. And like, it was just like very weird. And anyway, yeah, so I can only imagine that had a significant impact. I remember too, when I learned that your dad was famous, and that like, I someday, we're all gonna take a field trip, maybe when we start Braver Angels Venezuela, which, with all due respect to Venezuela, probably could be used there. And we'll just like follow you around and watch, like, who knows, Acosta-Rivas and all that. So actually, so before we get into the next question, I want to I wouldn't normally do this, but I want to sort of introduce my own background with Latin America, just because I do actually have one. Obviously, I'm not Latina. I was born in Kansas, or actually technically in Denver, but I grew up in Kansas, and to a mostly Irish family, and I'm like white as white bread. However, I loved Spanish in school, and probably the most meaningful experience of my youth, like pre-college years, that was like a big thing, was I did a program called Amigos de las Americas, which was sort of like the Peace Corps for high school students. And I spent a summer in Honduras, in a little village in the West. And it was genuinely life-changing in that I, a couple different ways. I learned to get over myself a little bit, and that life didn't have to be comfortable for you to be happy, and there were things like that. But I also, more importantly, it actually was the start of, in some ways, of my political views, because that's where I saw real community. And I saw, like, I got to live with a family, and like every night, like all the women in the family would crowd into the living room and watch soap operas in black and white on this little tiny television. And then like some nights we'd go over to the neighbors who were our relatives or their relatives are, but to play music. And like all the kids ran around together, and we taught them how to play Go Fish, and then taught them how to cheat. And like, it just felt really rich. And like, it was a stunning contrast to the isolation I felt in the place in Kansas I grew up. And so I came back thinking, man, there is something about the way that those cultures are doing things that ours really, really could learn from. And for the rest of my life, I've been a communitarian, and I care a lot about social isolation. And anyway, it was the start of it all. And it also, like, yeah, I have had a lifelong love for Latin America since then. I've also spent some time in Argentina, and my husband grew up in Brazil, and we are contemplating, assuming God willing that we have kids, living in a Spanish speaking country for a couple of years in Latin America somewhere, so that they can pick up the language too. And anyway, it just, it's a place that like is really close to my heart. And so I'm going to ask you some questions that are a little more, I don't know, coming from a perspective of some familiarity with the place, the place as though it's one place, but like, just sort of know that that's where I'm coming from on that. So one thing, the next thing I wanted to ask is, well, actually, I'll start with a story. So an interesting thing happened when I worked at the Aspen Institute, where with David Brooks, I co-founded Weave the Social Fabric Project, which in some ways, the core of that project is to find the people who are in every community who hold it together, right? The people who are still trusted, who everybody knows, like, oh, you need help with something real, like go to that guy. Or like, oh, we all know that like the place we would go if we were really in trouble is to this person, or this priest is really like the reason that our community, like, he knows everybody and everything. And we call those people weavers. And the philosophy of Weave was, at least when I was there, was that America had moved from a culture of community and service and sort of volunteerism, to use a Tocqueville word, like lots of volunteering, to a culture of individualism, and one where there's a lot of social isolation, and where it's not that people verbally or intentionally prioritize themselves, but in their actions they do. And there's not the same just ethos of what it means to live a good life is one that is intensely involved with your local community. And so we then, one of my core responsibilities at the start of the project was to go around and find a bunch of weavers. And so we went around to lots of communities and asked, like, who do you trust? And as usual, we found folks in a wide variety of places, all socioeconomic strata. We found people with lots of different religious backgrounds, and we intentionally, of course, recruited people of color. And one of those groups was Latinos. And but there was an interesting challenge with Latinos in particular, which is that when we got to those communities, they would say, and we would talk about how, like, we're all about, like, restoring a culture of service to the community and community centricness. And they would say, hey, this is what we do. Like, are you, I mean, like, we love you, we love this, but, like, I don't think I'm going to come to your stuff because we already do this. And which, as my, like, little Latino loving heart, like, beat a little stronger, being like, yeah, see, they already got this. But what it led me to wonder is that basically it seemed to me that America needed to learn from the Latino community with regard to being a weaver, not so much the other way around. And so I want to ask, I don't know though how that plays out politically. And so I want to ask, like, does the Latino community need help bridging the political divide? Does it, like, how does that divide show up in the Latino community versus the way it appears in other communities? By the way, when I say the Latino community, I also realize that, like, once again, it is not one thing. We're talking about a continent and half of another continent. And so, but just if you'll forgive the generalization, I'm curious, in your respective experiences, how big a problem even is this? And what does it feel like? And Monica, I think we'll start with you, since you have, I know, spoken about this a bit publicly.
Yeah, a bit. I thought with your story that you would ask us more about just community and bonding, sort of, for what it is and kind of in a general sense, but you were also asking about the political divide. So I was like, oh wait, those are really almost two questions. I think that you are right.
Please speak to both.
Yeah, because I've observed, I mean, in my own family in Mexico, enormously close. I mean, for us, the family is extremely important. And I grew up with that. I mean, here's a great example. I started to realize as a teenager in the United States how unusual it was that I would go to Mexico every summer and there would be a party every Monday. And the party every Monday would be at one of my aunts or uncles or grandparents' houses. It always rotated. Party every Monday. And my cousins, I have lots of cousins, who are dating or whatever, they would invite their boyfriends and girlfriends and friends to the family party every week. There was no sense of this isn't cool. There was no sense of, oh, don't even talk to my mom at all. And in the United States, there would be, at least, the people I knew, that, you wouldn't have mixed family and friends that way.
For sure.
So that was one thing that I noticed as a really stark contrast. And then the other thing that I would bring up is there's a lot of communities in Latin America. I've traveled and done kind of service in Guatemala and Peru, and I've gone to El Salvador with the U.S. State Department. That was interesting. But another thing about Latin America is that a lot of the governments are not terribly responsive and connected to people. And so if people take care of themselves, they have to take care of each other. In my family, like the police, it's not really, I don't know, you're not sure if police are wrapped up in the cartels. You don't know what's going on. You don't really know who to trust. And so you trust each other. So I think that there's a lot to that there's bonds of trust that build where they can, and that family is so built in. And of course, there's a lot of faith traditions in Latin America that bond family even closer together. And so, yeah, there is that sense. The political divide in the United States is really complicated with Latinos in the United States, precisely because of what you refer to many times in this episode, which is Latinos are just not one thing. And that is the most important thing to say right out. I mean, Daniel, you're in Miami, right? Miami politically is so interesting. And you go to Miami and people actually know the difference. Like white people know the difference between Mexicans and Cubans and Puerto Ricans and whatever. Up here in Seattle, nobody cares. You're Hispanic. Nobody even asks beyond, right? So there's different parts of the United States where the Hispanic identity is really present. And so there's an opportunity to get to know the diversity more. And then there's a lot of places where the Hispanic identity is not really present. And so it's only known on a superficial level. But in all cases, like everything gets so much more complicated. For example, the issue of race with colorism, right? In Latin America, it's about how dark you are versus how light. And I have some horror stories from my family where I've like seen, the ugliness of that. So everything becomes more complicated and gets these different dimensions that the mainstream conversation about these issues doesn't bring. Abortion, Latinos, many of them come with deeper faith traditions, deeper Catholic traditions. With race, we think of things maybe differently. Our experience is a lot more about colorism. It's mixed with class. I know lots of folks like there's like servants in Mexico, there's servants that are hired in families, and it's a very, you can see the racial kind of hierarchy there. There's indigenous populations that are very different from indigenous populations in the United States. There's such an enormous difference in culture that I feel like you don't even know where to begin. Where do you begin to complicate all of that with someone who has zero experience with it is really tough. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just on your point about police, I think I've mentioned that my husband went into policing, and when he explains why, the place he always starts is the same thing you said, that when his family moved to Brazil, they were told, their neighbors told them where all the 3 phones in the neighborhood were. And they said, if something happens to you, don't call the police, call us. And I really do think that obviously it's wonderful that we live in a society where at least the police are somewhat trustworthy some of the time. But there really is something about trusting each other that is, boy, I think we need that. So thank you. Daniel, I'm curious, like in your experience, talk to us about community and how does the political divide show up even in your own life? Like, talk to us.
Yeah, definitely. I think one particular aspect of the community that or one particular, memory that keep popping up while you were talking about that was, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about until right now, or until a week ago. I was helping a friend move here in DC, and she had, whoever the previous tenants were had left behind a lamp, and it was a note like, you can have it if you want, if not, throw it out. And then we just placed the lamp outside, and within a few minutes, somebody walked by and was like, hey, is this free for the taking? And then we had a conversation with them for like 10 minutes. And I realized, I'm like, that's the first time in the US that I can like think of where I've had a significant interaction with somebody's neighbor, like not even my own, just with a neighbor in general. Whereas in Venezuela, we had, my parents' best friends were our neighbors who lived in the apartment right in front. Because the day they moved in, they were like, our door's unlocked, and if we're having a party, the door's going to be open, and it's so that anybody can just walk in, right, and participate. And we became very close with them to the point of where we actually, my parents still keep in touch with them, right? And we haven't lived in Venezuela now for, 2022? It's been, I don't even know, like over 12 years, whatever, over 13 years. But meanwhile, our neighbors in the US, the people who live near my parents' house, I don't think they've ever interacted with them. I don't think we know their names. I know one of them still like says hi to my dad in a way that leads us to believe that he thinks my dad is married to my mom still, which is very funny because they've been divorced for 10 years or whatever, but he's still like, oh, like Mr. Acosta or whatever, or like, oh, like I think once he introduced him to like his son, he was like, this is the man of the house. And my dad doesn't even live in that apartment, but that's how little like connection there is between, neighbors, I guess, here. I've lived in this apartment in DC now for 3 years. Once again, I have no idea who my neighbors are. I don't think I've ever interacted with them. And that's just very, very different from how it was back home. And it's something that I hadn't really truly processed until right now, but it's definitely like very, very different. And I noticed that once we moved to the US, sort of that community feel, I think, sort of dissipated amongst my family. Even though we were surrounded by Hispanics, it's like gotten weaker as time's gone on. I mean, my parents are very Catholic, but they definitely go to church less since we moved to the US, right, than they did when we were in Venezuela. I mean, I went to Catholic school in Venezuela, so I went to church a lot more frequently, but it wasn't until I was older and out of my own volition in college that I sort of started going to church again, right? Which is something that's changed a lot. And then one thing that I wanted to tackle in terms of like political polarization and sort of the political divide amongst Hispanics and Latinos, it's interesting. It's, because in some regards, my parents are very politically opinionated. My sister's not so much, but there's like political differences between my family. And when it comes to Venezuelan politics, prior to the Maduro and sort of like Chavez regime, they'll have like joke debates, quote unquote, right? So my sister's fiance's dad was visiting for New Year's, and it turns out he was of like in the previous sort of political system, he was of a different political party than my dad, right? So they'd like bully each other over it. But that was it. That was as far as it got. Now, obviously, if he had been pro-regime, then that would have been a very different conversation, and he would have probably been kicked out of the house. But interestingly, in the US, I've noticed, especially in the 2020 election, how both sides here in the US have sort of tried to use the political situation in Latin America to pit Hispanics against each other, or like to have them choose one party over another. I remember in particular, a lot of the Republican messaging in Florida was along the lines of like, oh, like you fled socialism in Cuba and in Venezuela, you don't want that with Biden. And there was a Biden ad in somewhere, I think it was in Miami, and I remember seeing a photo of this where it was a picture of Trump, but then it had Chavez's eyes, like Photoshop, like superimposed. And so it's like both sides were saying like, if you vote Democrat / if you vote Republican, you're voting for the same thing you fled back home, right? And then you start seeing a lot of that rhetoric where now my parents, if they meet Venezuelans that are like slightly more to the left of center, they're like, oh, see, they didn't learn anything from what we had back home. And vice versa. Some Venezuelans who are like anti-Trump are like, see, they don't learn anything about like the dangers of populism or whatever. And it's a weird division that really wasn't there before. But it's sort of like, it's almost like being fostered here for political purposes, because it's a good way of getting like one side. Because yeah, like Hispanics are in monoliths, right? And even within Venezuelans are in monoliths because there's so many sort of different like cultures that are present in Venezuela. And I think Venezuela specifically is like a lot more multicultural than your average like Latin American country to begin with. So it's just it's interesting to see that kind of be exploited here in the US, like for political gain, essentially.
Yeah, this is fascinating and kind of sad and like really interesting. And I really appreciate you both speaking to that. I actually want to turn to the positive side for a minute. So, like I said, part of the theory of all this is that there's a lot we could learn from, different voices. I am a little C Catholic in that I think that all the different pieces of maybe human society and I would say faith, but whatever, have one piece of the elephant to mix metaphors, like. And that there's some piece of the truth that we really need to hear from this quote set of communities. And so I want to ask the question specific to our work, right? So we work to bridge divides. We work to bring people together. We work for reconciliation, and reconciliation through truth, in my opinion, and also just also just being neighbors, like just being able to like live with each other in a simple way. And so I'm curious, what can the rest of us learn from from y'all's, like, insofar as there is one, the experiences of bridging that you've had that you feel are particularly Latin? And yeah, Daniel, you want to go first this time?
Sure. I think one particular aspect, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase it, but I feel like, at least with my family and like from my personal experience, I feel like Hispanics, we can be, I'm trying not to generalize because I recognize that we're not all the same, but we can be very, very like laid back about certain things, right? Like politics.
Interesting.
Where it's like, yeah, like things get heated, but I don't think anybody in my family would ever like excommunicate anybody else, right? For political reasons or religious reasons, right? Well, to the point of where like even now, my dad, who was a journalist back home, we were sort of driven out by the regime. My dad worked with the opposition in the 2006 election. But my dad's like, yeah, I have friends who are Chavistas and who support the regime, and I maintain those friendships with them. Like, I disagree with them vehemently, but I also know that deep down they're good people, right? And like he still maintains those friendships with them, and it's the kind of thing that he might not say on his show, right? For fear of the audience reaction, but you know, it's something that is true, and he does have those friends. And I think seeing that even in a situation where it's like such a bitter divide, right? I think is something that we can all like learn from. And we have family members, you know, sometimes in family gatherings that they start talking about politics, they'll disagree to the point of where it's, if I was watching some of my American friends have like that type of discussion, I'm like, oh boy, like this friend group is not going to last, is it? But with my family, it's like, I know that like, okay, after all is said and done, they're just going to drink whiskey and everything's going to be okay kind of thing. And it's sort of that like laid backness, like, you know, my family always likes to joke about how it's something along the lines of like, oh, in Venezuela, bullying is not an issue because somebody makes fun of you and then you make fun of them back and that's it. And I'm sure bullying is an issue to an extent, but at the same time, like there is something to be said about how we just sort of don't take everything to heart, right? The good or the bad. And so somebody says something and we say something back and that's it. We're still friends. We still get along. I believe in Spanish, the phrase is like chalequeo in Venezuela. And it's just like kind of like that bullying in between friends where you like fight each other on things and like you kind of take each other's rough edges out on each other. But it ends up forming a stronger relationship. Whereas here sometimes or at least with some of my friends here in the US, I've seen it do the opposite. So I guess that's one way. I'm not sure if that's the best way to phrase it, but I think it's like that laid back aspect of it, I guess.
I love that. I love that. I want to ask a follow-up question, but Moni, if you have a quick comment.
I mean, I just want to agree with all of that. I mean, that's something where apparently Daniel and I have a similar experience. For me, I remember that all of my cousins, I learned this later after I lived in the United States for a while. I don't like spicy food very much. And so I have to defend that among Americans. Like, how could you like spicy food? Because I don't like spicy food. But my cousins, actually turns out that my aunts and uncles, since they were little, would give them jalapenos as like a punishment. Like, oh, you did something wrong, eat a jalapeno. And there was an ulterior motive, which was to desensitize them to jalapenos so that they could have jalapenos and be good at spicy food. And sure enough, like all my cousins are good at spicy food and I'm not, because I was never given that heat. So I guess the analogy to me is I do think that there is something to the stereotype of more color and more heat in a lot of Latino cultures that is true for my family, where people don't hold back. I agree that there's a laid backness, and I would say that it's more about like you're just really trusting of the connections and the bonds that you have, and so that gives you clearance to just say what you mean and be loud about it and be spicy, like, you know, just add the heat to the conversation. It's fine, you know. And then yeah, I've written about this with my family, but like with my family, you have a meal. And 3 hours later, you're still at the table talking. So there's just a lot of convivencia. There's a lot of just hanging out and talking and talking and talking and talking. So there's a lot of practice, I think, coming up against disagreement and then figuring out what to do. Now, I have aunts and uncles who, particularly aunts who have like not talked to each other for months, you know, because they've been so mad, but they all eventually come back. And I don't know, there's just something about that. It's just more heat. We're used to the heat.
I love that. I love what both of you have said here. Thank you. And I actually was wondering, because I've been trying to square how like it could be that, well, first of all, I just want to recognize that, Daniel, I think you just said that Venezuelans who have like Chavez and a crazy economy and like violence, when there's, you know, regime change, like that they actually get along better with regard to politics than we do. I think that is what you just said. And I just want to notice that for a second. And Moni, I feel like your comment really gives life to that, right? Like you said, somehow there's just a lot of trust and a lot of safety. And I have been trying to figure this out, because it does seem like Latino community is so tight, right? Like, and there's sort of it feels like maybe unconditional in a way that the other culture, white culture, I don't know, whatever, some other cultures don't have. Is that right? And I guess I'm also just curious, like, does that, what American individualist voices in my head say is, oh no, but what if you don't fit in?
Exactly.
Oh no.
Well, I was going to say that. Yeah, that's the downside. So
right.
Really, really strong communal cultures will, your aunts and uncles and grandparents and friends have expectations of you. And if you don't fit, they're going to make you feel it. And it's going to hurt more than a culture maybe more American, where we don't talk about those things, and we give each other maybe more space at the expense of more connection and deeper trust. So it is kind of so when it works, it's great. When you are kind of out, then you're going to want to leave and make your own destiny. So, but I feel like that is the eternal universal struggle between individualism and more communalism. Yes, that is the eternal struggle. So yeah, but I think it's out of necessity because, again, we don't have very, very strong, like wonderful democracies that take care of us, in Latin America. Like, I will say that a lot of immigrants I know from Latin America come to the United States and look at how much the United States is like, oh my God, our government sucks, everything's terrible. And it's like, yo, I've had how many cousins held up at gunpoint in their own neighborhoods? Like, we were terrified that one of my cousins had been kidnapped. Does that happen to you? Just like everybody, you can't call the police because they might be in with the cartel, like, yes, it's not great in the United States, but goodness, be grateful for what you have here, because you can lean on, one of the reasons individualism works here is because you can lean on systems. Exactly. You can't lean on systems in some other cultures. So.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I think at risk of sounding like an old curmudgeonly person, I do think that, like, boy, it's easy to complain, but gosh, it's worth noticing what else is out there. I want to actually just ask one more, because I'm so interested in this phenomenon where, like, there's real strong trust and, like, what that feels like, and that I like the jalapeno metaphor too, and the like bullying between friends. Like, this is great. Can you tell me more, like, a story, or, like, I'm just trying to feel it. I'm trying to get inside the mind of, like, what does it feel? It's hard, frankly, for me even to picture being at dinner. Well, my particular family does dinner for many, many hours and talks about politics a lot. But, like, I think for a lot of us, it's hard to picture, like, that not being a really high stakes thing, like, that it's just going to be okay. Like, what does that feel like? Give me more pictures. Either of you can pick that up.
Yeah, I'm trying to think like particular stories. But I guess sort of the story is escaping me, and that's not okay. But I think it's just, it definitely sort of like that sense of trust is so strong, even within family, where it's like, it's like second nature. Like, I don't have, like, it's difficult to come up with examples because that's just like the reality of the fact that, like, even though my, people in my family may not have the same political opinions about stuff in the US or stuff in Venezuela, like, they still sort of get together. And, like, mind you that my family might just be the weird exception. I don't think it is, or it doesn't sound like it is, at least from what Monica is sharing as well. But it's the norm. It's just what we're used to. And so we don't really, like, think about it. Now, mind you, there's examples, that I've heard from friends where, in Colombia, right, with the guerrillas and stuff, where there's, like, very deep divides where it's like one parent is, like, pro guerrilla and the other one is, like, pro, like, the other side in the conflict, and then they just don't talk about politics. And that's how they coexist. They just never bring it up. Both sides think both parents think they vote the same way, and the child knows that that's not the truth. And that's it. Same thing in Venezuela. Like, there are, especially, like, as the years have progressed, some people where it's like, will have the mentality of, like, oh, like, this person's unforgivable, right? Because they've been pro-regime for so long that's it. We'll never bring them back, or, like, we'll never sort of take them back. Or if they're seen as, like, complicit rather than just believing in it, right? But for the most part, at least within my family, like, that's just not been, I mean, mind you, if we have an uncle who, like, we know voted for Chavez, like, my dad will definitely make comments about him behind his back, right? And sometimes to his face as well, right? If he's still, if he's come around now. But it was not like, oh, you're not my brother anymore, right? Because you supported like an opposing political party. I think one particular example is, so my sister in my family, and she probably hates me talking about this, but we have always accused her of being like very high strung and being very like wanting to be sort of like the mom in the family. And I remember specifically there was a couple months where my uncle and my aunt were visiting, so they were staying with us in Miami, and they noticed that, you know, my brother and I would get home from school and we'd ask my sister if we could have a cookie, and she'd be like, no, you have to eat lunch if you're hungry. So we'd eat lunch, and they were like, all right, we had lunch, can we have dessert? She's like, if you're hungry, you're gonna eat more lunch. And so we couldn't have any snacks, right? Like it was just very like dictatorial. And so my uncles just started like calling her like different dictators, right? So like one day they'll be like, here comes Pol Pot, or like here comes, you know, like Stalin or whatever, whenever my sister would come home. Or like they'd pretend they were talking about her while she was like showering. And so they like stand outside the bathroom and really loudly be like, oh, clearly like you're you know, your sister's the dictator of the house or whatever. And like, yeah, my sister would get annoyed, but it never harmed the relationship, right, between them. Even when it got to the point of where like my uncles actively were undermining her authority by like sneaking candy into the house and being like, here you go, shove it underneath your bed, your sister's not looking, like have as much candy as you want. And you know, my brother and I would get emboldened, and then we'd make fun of her, right? So for like the longest time, I would like make jokes about. So I think one of the things my sister used to say would be like, "Yeah, boy, like I'm on my way." Like whenever she was like late for something and she was in the shower or whatever, and so there'd be jokes about like, "Oh, like why did Andrea not show up to the wedding?" And it's like, 'cause she kept saying like, "Yeah, boy, yeah, boy, yeah, boy," you know, like, and just like, but it was just that kind of relentless bullying, and it's like, yeah, that exists to an extent in the U.S., but it's like we take it past just that, right? But it's still not considered like an attack on the person. Like my sister knows we love her, and we know that, like, right? And so it's the kind of example that like you might hear of that, right, with an American family and be like, oh yeah, like that's perfectly normal. But I think the difference is that like we also took it to other places, right? Be it like religion, right, or be it like politics, and it wasn't like toxic. It wasn't considered, right? It wasn't driving us apart, I guess. Maybe that's like a good way to phrase it.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Moni, super curious what you've had a thoughtful look into this.
No, I love those stories. So I'm thinking of two things. One is the number of people that are around, and the other is the level of intimacy. So to paint the picture, las Mesadoras, the rocking chairs at my grandfather's house. That was the place where, I mean, in the summers when I was there, you know, my grandfather had 5 daughters, all of them have kids. Everyone would just stop by. So that's one thing to understand, that I think in a lot of other American cultures, you don't stop by, you call ahead, you make sure it's okay to come over. No, there's constant collisions. There's constantly people coming over. It's what you do. It's like, there's nothing else to do. You go and you hang out with each other. It's fun. It's enjoyable. So the rocking chairs outside my grandfather's house, you know, the sun's gone down. It's like this humid heat outside. There's 4 of these rocking chairs, and there's also these little steps. And so the kids would sit on the steps because the adults would get the rocking chairs. But then the adults would have to get, you know, and then there was one rocking chair just for my grandfather, but it was just, you know, I remember I'd go in for like a Coca-Cola, you know, because they deliver in Mexico still. I think they deliver Coca-Colas like the milkman delivered milk, like actually in a case, and you subscribe. I'm not even kidding. Wow. And go and like crack open a Coca-Cola and like bring it back outside. And when I had gone inside, you know, everyone was laughing. It was really like fun kind of banter. And I got inside to get my Coke. I come back out and there's this hush, you know, because my tia Nelly and my abuelito are now arguing, right? And then what happens is like bit by bit, everyone just starts to kind of crowd around and chime in on the argument or whatever it is. But like, no, papa, like that's not right. You got to think of it this way, but like, this is this. And they come in and it goes on forever. And I remember how late, you know, like there was no such thing as a bedtime for me when we visited Mexico or any of my cousins. Like we stayed until people left, and people left at 1 a.m. Who knows? And so there was just a lot of people talking all the time. And then the other thing is the level of intimacy. So to this day, my family, you come in, you enter a room where others are. And by the way, family or friends, by the way, it's important to note that we can call tia, like aunt, to a close friend of a relative. So people's friends and relatives all feel like family. And so when you come into a room because you've just arrived, you go around and you kiss everyone on the cheek. And then when you leave, you go around and you kiss everyone on the cheek. Se despide. So to say goodbye, to despedirte, you have to do that. You have to be, so it's kind of, it'd be pretty terrible to leave a room or, have the kind of fight where you couldn't then say goodbye in the right way. You have to say goodbye in the right way, So that ritual, I think, is extremely important in ways that I hadn't really appreciated, right? But it doesn't exist in the United States. Like even the handshake is sort of optional. But yeah, you got to kiss them on the cheek when you come in, and you got to kiss them on the cheek when you leave.
That is so interesting. I just love these stories. And it's, by the way, I'm just going to observe that you have both now used the phrase, I hadn't thought about that until now, which just speaks to how thoroughly in you it is, right? And embedded, and of course. And I also just have to say, you're making me really jealous. Like, I want to be part of a community like that. Like, that sounds great. Adopt me and do some, I'll be a chichilla. Like, by the way, I do have a little bit of this because my, one of my sisters-in-laws married a Brazilian man, and they speak Portuguese at home. And so I get to be a chichilla to their kids, which is an auntie. But somehow it's cuter in Portuguese. Anyway, well, so this is wonderful. And it's a vision of what I hope someday we can be more like. And so actually, like, to that end, it is not a secret that Latinos are dramatically underrepresented in Braver Angels and in the bridging movement more broadly. The reason I started with the question, and I do think that there may be some of that, which is they don't need it in the same way that everybody else does, sort of like was true with Weave. So that may be part of the answer here, but there, I think that's not all of it. And so I want to tell another story from Aspen, which it really, I'm very grateful for my time at Aspen and Weave, and mostly these are jumping off points for me. And so another thing that I learned, or like a thing that happened, was I had a Latina friend of mine who commented at one point that her parents, that when I was talking to her about like how hard I was finding it to recruit Latin folks to come to our stuff, even though like I knew they had weavers, what she said was that, well, my parents, if I were to ask my parents about this, they would say, oh, no, I'm not going to come to that. That's not for me. And what that meant was not like, I think I'm too good for it. It really was, it doesn't seem like it's for me. Like it's for somebody else. Like, I don't know who necessarily, but it's not for me. And that really stuck with me, because I think that creating spaces that people actually feel like are for them, when you're trying to reach a diverse group, is hard. And like that there's all this stuff in the ether and in like the signaling and all this stuff that's there that people are picking up on. And like, we all do it to some degree. And so I don't know if this is a good example for you guys, but because it would be for me and because it was for my friend, I want to talk about what it would take to recruit your parents, like, or you can pick some other family members if you want to, but I'm curious. So first, would your parents or other family members that you choose, I know that you have lots of options because you have this really cool connected family. Would they feel like Braver Angel stuff is like not for them? And if so, what are some of the things that would make them feel that way? And I guess the last thing I'll tag onto that is, do those things mirror dynamics around inclusion in America more broadly? Or do you think they're somewhat particular to each thing? And Monica, you can pick that up first if you want.
Yeah, do they mirror dynamics and inclusion more broadly? So first off, my parents are Braver Angels members. Yay! And they voted for Trump, and I voted, Clinton and Biden. So we're politically divided, which is a whole other thing. But they've taken the Red Blue Workshop and they've loved it, and they've never given me a sense of, it's not for us. But they also have spent now a huge part of their adult life in the United States around not a lot of other Hispanics. So they are not, it is not that important to them at all that the things that they do have other people like them. in the Hispanic identity. I think a lot of it has to do with how closely people attach to certain identities, because when people are attached very closely to those identities, then the question, is it for me, really does boil down to, are there other people like me already there? And if I don't see those other people, then the answer is no. So that happens with a lot of groups in, inclusion type of efforts. And I think that's a pretty universal principle for folks who identify strongly with their identities. And I think one thing that we should all remember is that not everybody does to the same degree. And so there's that, right? But to those who do, and that's the group that they travel in, and that's where they feel most comfortable, then, Braver Angels, it just doesn't show that kind of rainbow yet, right? That we know we want to. And that's a challenge. That's going to be tough. So that's where the dynamics seem really similar to me on what it would take. So there's that. But then, April, I think that your instinct is probably right, without any data to back it up, that I think there are cultures that take care of each other well enough that the anxiety that would arise around political polarization doesn't affect them as much. I think that cultures that are more individualistic and are less communal have less, they don't lean on each other. And so when the news headlines show an America on fire because it's so polarized, it actually bothers them to a really deep level. But I think there are people who have really healthy lives, personal lives, or they can just like chat up some stuff, and then those kinds of anxieties don't penetrate as deeply because they have rich, meaningful lives with a lot of other stuff going on and a lot of deep connections. And so maybe, yeah, like that matters. And maybe on these particular issues that really matters. And yeah, but maybe overall that anxiety isn't quite as acute and they don't feel as hopeless. So that's total theory for me. I'm just pulling out of thin air.
Totally. How about you, Daniel? What about your folks?
Yeah, so for my parents, it would be interesting because they would probably fall under the not for me camp, but for the reasons of they'd feel like, oh, well, I'm not an extremist and I'm not polarized, or so I there's no need for me to go to talk to people who have opposing viewpoints because I'm not crazy to one end or crazy to the other end, right? In their words. Or similarly, I think definitely my parents are guilty of it. I'm not sure, maybe Venezuelans more broadly, but definitely my parents and my extended family are guilty of confusing like depolarization with like conversion, right? So let's say you were to host a like Braver Angels debate, right? And the topic was like Chavismo has failed or Chavismo hasn't failed. To them, like it wouldn't be a successful debate if they understood why people were for Chavez. It would be a successful debate if like people no longer supported Chavez by the end of it, right? It's just like, so it's the topics, I guess, that would interest them, or it's the topics for their like, yeah, that debate didn't do anything for me because those people, yeah, sure, I understand it, but they still believe that and whatever. So it's a very interesting, I guess, view in that way. But I think for sort of Hispanics more broadly, I think Monica brought up a good point with like sort of like that deep-seated anxiety that comes from like polarization just isn't that, I guess, like buried in or that painful. I mean, my parents sometimes will get worried about like the direction the US is heading in, right? Because they're like, oh, like it seems like people on both sides are sort of off the rocker and there's so much like conflict like politically and it's just making every side more and more extremist. But then they talk about it on the phone with me, right, for like an hour and then they're fine and then they go about their day and they're no longer stressed about it, right? Whereas I'm like stressed out and like having heart palpitations and I'm like talking to them because I'm like, can you believe that this person just won office or whatever? And then that's it, right? And so it's very, I'm not sure if it's just like, I think it's similar to, living in DC whenever my friends are like, oh, like I'm living in, not me particularly, but they're like, oh, I'm living in such a dangerous area. And I'm like, no, you're not. I grew up in Caracas. Like, I think it's like our barometer is just broken for what is political conflict. Right. So to them, it's like, well, people aren't like, I mean, yeah, to them, it's like, yeah, like nobody threw a tear gas grenade into my studio, right? Because I was talking against the president. So like, I think everything's really that bad, right? Like, or there's not like government sponsored like paramilitaries like that circle every single day and like motorcycles and like shoot at protesters. So like, yeah, they're not that bad, So I think it's that, like, it just doesn't bother them as much, even if they are overall concerned with like the direction the country's heading in and like the political divisions. I think the concern with them is less the division itself and more, and maybe this is just speaking of like Venezuelans and maybe Cubans since it's kind of like a similar background, But it's, the concern is less like, oh, the country is so divided and a house divided can't stand. And it's more, oh, like we fear that the country will go the same way that the countries we fled, right? That the home we fled. And to them, that's not inherently because of the division. It could just be because of extremism one way or another, or authoritarianism one way or the other, but not because people are polarized themselves, if that makes sense. So it's a very interesting scenario. I do think for maybe Hispanics that aren't Venezuelan, or at least Hispanics that aren't my parents, having more immigrants or more Hispanics and Latinos who show up to the events is what would attract them more. And so it's like the chicken or the egg scenario, which is like, how do you bring more of a community in so that they feel represented, so that they want to actively participate in it more, I guess. And then it's just a matter of, I think, having these conversations in the spaces that they inhabit, right? You know, if you host, it's one thing, right? Like you're going to get a different kind of group of people or a different audience if you host a debate in DC. But if you were to host a debate in, you know, Miami-Dade Community College, right? That's probably 99.9% either immigrant or like first generation. You're going to get like, they'll definitely show up, and from there maybe migrate over to like other debates with other regions, right? But yeah, I think that's a very long-winded way of saying my parents probably think that this is not for them.
This is awesome. No, gosh, I love doing these podcasts because I learned so much. Thank you. And you but the two of you together just listed like 8 different reasons, all of which I think are really persuasive. And they lead me to ask sort of a different question than I had planned. I was going to ask, oh, you know, what would it take to like and make more people feel comfortable? And you've sort of answered that, but I have a different question on my mind, which is, what do you think the value proposition is for the Latino world for Braver Angels? And if there isn't one, that's okay. Like, or rather, I'm not trying to, the fact that we have a product doesn't mean people have to need it, right? Like, but I'm just curious, like, if you were to, so I know what I would say, which is something to do with the idea that our democracy is a lot more fragile than it looks, and particularly around trust in peaceful in elections and things like that. It's the way to keep it from becoming those things that you fear is this kind of work. But I do wonder, like, I mean, would it be that like the thing to pitch them on is like, so support our work in Congress, or like support like as opposed to like with neighbors, or is it like, or maybe there's, I don't know, or maybe there's something that I'm missing around like how to take that family trust and level it up or out to the community. Like, yeah. So what thoughts on, Daniel, go ahead. I think you get where I'm going.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple of things. I think one key aspect you mentioned is like sort of like having them or helping the Latino community understand that democracy is a very fragile thing. One thing I've definitely noticed, not just with my family, but like with almost every sort of like immigrant family that I know, is that despite the fact that we've lived through the collapse of 5.5 million democracies back home, right? And every other day there's a coup and the craziest conspiracy theories about what's going on in the United States government. Here it's a conspiracy theory, but back home it's just the news. Despite all of that, when we get to the US, we immediately just think, oh, but that can't happen here. Like we've always been taught like the US is great and like that can't happen here. That won't happen here. It's the United States. The United States could never collapse, right? And so we take it for granted that like there are things that are actively undermining like the democratic process. Like if you can't get along with your neighbor, or you literally think that your neighbor wants to kill you because they're voting for the wrong person, right? Like it's something that we can't process, I think, even though we've lived it in Latin America, but it's just because we see the US as this great place. It reminds me of that one, I think it was like an anecdote with Ronald Reagan where he's talking to Cuban exiles and then he turns to Nancy Reagan and he's like, you don't know how lucky we are to have been born in the United States. And then the Cuban exiles go like, how lucky you are. We had somewhere to escape to, right? And it's kind of like that to us. Like the US is the place we escape to. So the US cannot fall and it won't. And so we don't think of the issues that are here. And I think another significant, I guess, value proposition of the sort of conversation that Braver Angels has is exposing the Latino community to other communities. Because as communal as we can be, we're very insular. And with a couple exceptions, what tends to happen is that, a Latino enclave will form somewhere in the US or in the neighborhood or whatever, and then they'll keep to themselves. And so some of the sort of like prejudices that Monica kind of touched upon, right, in terms of like colorism or things like that against other communities don't actually get addressed, because rather than going from living in Latin America to a cultural melting pot, is you go from living in Venezuela to living in Little Venezuela, right? Or, and from Cuba to Little Havana. And so you don't actually get that sort of multiculturalness aspect of the United States. And so, as accepting and as much as I love my family, every now and then they'll say something where I'm like, oh, yikes, like that's not okay. Like that has some very bad undertones, and you should definitely not say that outside of our home. Probably not at all, but definitely not outside of our home. But it's because of that, there's no exposure to Americans, to the Asian communities, to the African American communities. And so I think the aspect of like getting that community to expand, it's maybe that sounds paradoxical, because the whole point of a community is that it's like tight knit, but getting it to expand and to include other people who aren't Hispanic, I think is like a big step, because there are Hispanic communities that the reason they choose to live in predominantly Hispanic communities and stay within them is because they might feel like they're not welcome in a white neighborhood or in an African American neighborhood or in an Asian neighborhood, right? And so you sort of have that like self-segregated aspect of it. And then the more that people move to one particular area, so the more the people that move to Doral, the more that it was, oh, we're going to leave Brazil, or we're going to leave Venezuela, we're going to leave Colombia. We know there's a little area in Miami called Doral where there's tons of Latin Americans, and that's where we're going to go, right? And so I have friends who visit from like an hour up north, or not even 30 minutes up north, and I have to translate for them because we're in a part of town where nobody speaks English, right? I worked at a Starbucks for 2 years, and one of those years was working in Miami. And I had a couple customers who, when they walked over, I was like, hi, welcome to Starbucks. How may I help you? They're like, why are you speaking English? Then you're in Miami, you should be talking in Spanish. And I'm like, well, we live in the US. Like, that's not like, whatever. And just would have to switch to Spanish because they refuse to talk to me in English. But it's because of how much we sort of gravitate to each other and then just close off, right? And it's just us. And it's something I try to do with my friends. I think Monica mentioned the whole, that you gotta give everybody a kiss in the cheek. So I learned that in Washington, D.C., in polite society, you can't just kiss people in the cheek when you just meet them. They give you really weird looks. But with my friend group, whenever they come over, like it's always like a hug, hello, a hug, goodbye. And I have friends who are American who are like, I always thought that was so weird because it's like, I'm gonna see you tomorrow. Why are you saying goodbye? But I'm like, that's just what we do. It's rude. And I just like walk out of your house, like without acknowledging. And I'm not just going to wave either. That's kind of awkward. To the point where like now my friend group, whenever they all see each other, even if I'm not there, they all give each other hugs and then give each other hugs goodbye. Right. But it's just because I'm like, yeah, like I just forced it into my friend group because I refuse to believe that I could just walk out and be like, bye.
I love it. Yeah. Very thoughtful. Moni.
Yeah.
Curious. Yeah,
just a few more thoughts. Those are great. I've been thinking about it, but let's take something like the Brave Angels workshop, Families Divided by Politics. And it's a great workshop. And even though maybe, right, Latino cultures have closer, tighter knit families where trust is less of an issue, it also is a culture where family matters loads. And so if there is a conflict within a family, I think the Latino heart beats particularly like loudly about fixing it. So you would think that appealing to, there are people in the Latino community, especially, intergenerationally, especially, and the divide between first generation and second generation immigrants is enormous for all the reasons Daniel just talked about, right? Where your parents know what it was like, in this other country that was a lot worse. And so maybe they're not taking as seriously the problems in the United States as their children. Their children are going to college, their children are incensed, right? And now there's this rift, right? What do you do with that rift? And I can tell you, those parents are going to want to know what to do with that rift. But the Brave Angels Families Divided by Politics workshop does not take into account at all the completely different kind of construction of family relationships that would exist in Latino cultures. And so now I'm wondering, what if we created Families Divided by Politics for Latino cultures? And it was co-created by folks from different Latino cultures, and then it was put in the slate of what we offer because, hey, like there's a bunch of flavors, there's a bunch of cultures that make up who we are. And the other thing too is that with Latinos, we didn't talk about undocumented immigrants. I've interviewed many, I know many, and undocumented immigrants really feel like they have to hide. And so any kind of involvement with an organization that's about being American, well, no, I mean, you can't do that. But even when you are documented, I think, again, because you come from cultures where you had to lean on each other and you didn't lean on the government or the system or the broader society, you don't really know how to do that. You don't know how to do it. So I wonder if there isn't like a way to more aggressively kind of say, this project is not complete without you. You are part of this. You're not excluded, because of this, that, or the other thing, because you come from another country. No, none of that is acceptable here. And so, yeah, there has to be, I think, a particular call to say, this is not complete without you somehow. And I'm just making this up, but I think that some people need to be told that to believe it.
I'm sold. You may be making it up, but I think it's really wise. Interestingly, I think it applies to actually quite a few communities. And but I can see how there's a particular reason and a particular context you need to speak into here, is because I can only imagine that if you've gone from having to hide to, oh yeah, now I'm legit, there would be residue.
And again, often you come so grateful that you're even here. Like some people had to, that you don't feel that it's a lot of entitlement, right? To try to make it better. I'm good, no, but we need you. This is how we hold ourselves together. The reason that this place is so good is because people sat up, right? So, but I mean, that's the eternal civic recruitment thing that will never stop being a challenge, right?
Yes. Although I do think that there's actually kind of an opportunity in what you just said, because if you have a bunch of folks who know how special this place is and know how important it is that it be preserved or reformed and all that, but that's if you can convince them that they're needed as part of that project, especially since they're already super into giving to the group. Anyway, I just think that could be really some of our best comrades in arms, or that's a weird way to say it, but yeah. Well, thank you. So we're going to do a wrap-up question. So I was going to go through the stereotypes exercise. I know we're running a little short on time. So I'm going to offer you options, and you can answer this any way you like. So the stereotypes exercise is, tell us about a stereotype about your group of people that you feel is inaccurate. Why is it inaccurate? And is there a kernel of truth? And then or rather than a kernel of truth, you could do what's the thing that you feel like is fair? And it can be positive, right? That's totally fine. So there's that. And then there are 3 questions here. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, what do you fervently wish people understood about the Latino, quote, the Latino community? And I'm going to ask you to go beyond just that it's diverse, because that's already been said. And I agree, that's sort of number 1. It's there's a lot here, but give me something different. And then the final question is, what's your favorite food? All of us love Latin food of many varieties. And, if you think you don't, and you're a listener to this podcast, I guarantee you it's because you have not tried all the cuisines, because there will be something you'll like. So yeah, talk to me about stereotypes. Tell me what you fervently wish people understood, and tell me about your favorite food, or a food that, has a good story to it, or whatever. Moni.
Okay. The stereotype one that came up for me is the one that growing up, my mother was always very conscious of, which was the stereotype that Latinos are lazy. These days, I feel like it can't be that many people still hold that. But I know that when I was growing up, they did. And I know that the cartoon Speedy Gonzales, had people with their sombreros over their heads and laying on the side. And so, yeah, I mean, that one, if anyone out there still thinks Latinos are lazy, my God, no, so hardworking, so incredibly hardworking. I think when I ask myself, what's the kernel of truth in it? I go, maybe what like mainstream, more white America took as laziness might be that like Latino workers like to be at home with their families and not work all day, every day, and that they enjoy like taking breaks and
how dare they,
like all that stuff and enjoying life. Like, I don't know, there's this Protestant work ethic impression, a stereotype that I have in my head about what America says when it says be productive and work hard is a little soul crushing sometimes. So that's the stereotype that I think of. The second question was,
what do you wish people understood?
What I wish people understood about the Latino community broadly.
/ your community. You can take it either way.
Okay, yeah. You know what? I do think that I do wish that people had a lot more open curiosity about the family stories and the immigrant stories, and in particular, other countries' experiences with the things we struggle with. I do think that in America has the privilege of not having to care what any other country south of us has done, is doing, has been through at all. Like I've been telling my friends that, the president of Mexico has like parallels to Trump in some interesting ways, but from the opposite side. And they're like, what? They don't know his name. They don't know what's going on. It's like fascinating. It's mind-blowingly cool. It's the country to the south of us. My family in Mexico is enormously divided by it. Like there's wacky things going on all up and down the continent and things that we could be learning from, right? Like we think we're kind of experimenting all on our own. No, I mean, there's been attempts and some successful ones at democracies just all over. And we have all these people from different communities who can tell you about it, can tell you something about it. And, not everybody who's here ran away from there. Like not everybody did. And so it's not necessarily always a horror story. Sometimes it's like, for example, in Mexico, there's campaign laws. I don't know if they're still in effect, but they were not that long ago, that presidential candidates can't start campaigning until like 6 months before the election, 3 or 6 months. And that was meant to make sure that the population wasn't completely inundated with media that made them dwell and ruminate and made it easier to spin things out of proportion. Wouldn't that be a good idea in the United States? So, there's things like that. I wish we were more curious about. We've got people here who actually represent and come from and hold different nationalities, and we could learn from other countries' attempts to build a good society.
All right, I'm going to stop you there because we'll do food all together at once in a second. So Daniel, stereotypes and what do you wish people understood?
Yeah, I think one stereotype, and I'm not sure if stereotype is the right word for it, but I definitely have noticed, or at least while I was an undergrad, a lot of my fellow classmates or former classmates had this idea that Latin America was like this bastion of like progressivism, which is like something that I always had to like very sort of like drill into them. I'm like, well, that's not necessarily the case, right? And even there, like that progressivism might not look like what you might define progressivism in the U.S. Or as progressivism in the U.S. But it was just like little things where it's like there's just so much. It's like misinformation or like misunderstanding, and I don't know if it comes from like pop culture or like pop journalism, I guess. Where it'll be like, oh, did you know that this country in Latin America passed a law requiring that 50% of their political parties candidates have to be female, like stuff like this, where it's like, okay, well, this isn't actually the case, right? Or like it wasn't done out of a desire to like be progressive. It was done out of a desire to like outlaw one political party because they knew it was an easy way to like win an election. But yeah, like there's this belief, and so I have a lot of friends who are like, oh, like, we need to be more, and so they ignore the things that function in the US because they're like, oh, whatever it is that the US is doing right, it's clearly not good enough because look at all these progressive policies that are being implemented in Latin America. So it's funny because they're the same people who, if the US were to do something that would be considered progressive or like forward thinking or to help some like minority group, they might think like, oh, like there's definitely some negative aspect to this, or it's being done for some nefarious reason. But then we'll look back at like ex-Latin American country and be like, look how they treat their indigenous community, and like the actual indigenous community in that country is not doing well at all, right? Even if on paper there's whatever law protecting them. So I guess I'm sure that's a stereotype, but I think it definitely tears up to the second part, which is something that I wish people knew or would stop doing. And I think the US has this like bad habit of portraying all war politics through like the bipartisan lens of US politics. So it's everything tries to fit into like Democrat and Republican and progressive and conservative. And that's just not the case. And like things just don't work that way. And they form a lot of very heated opinions about Latin American politics based on that, right? So I have friends who are conservative leaning who'll be like, oh, like Bolsonaro is the greatest president ever because he's right of center, right? So he must be Republican. And I have friends who are like left of center who are like, but wait, Maduro's left of center. Is he not the good guy? Like and I'm like, well, it's like, first of all, the left right thing is just very difficult to explain in general, but also like you can't just apply American politics to Latin America and expect to work. And that's not, I think, specific to Latin America. I think it's just specific to the whole world. I think it's just very easy. And I catch myself doing it, right? I'll be looking at, I don't know, like Hungarian politics. And I'll be like, so is that like a Democratic Party and that's the Republican Party? And it's like, obviously that's not the case. But I think those would be the two things. It ties into the whole, like, Hispanics aren't a monolith, Latinos aren't a monolith, but it's just like, it's true. It's something that can't be overstated. We're all very, 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 very different within each other's countries as well. And it's differences that, like, I didn't even really process while I was there. You know, like, it took me a really long time to realize that the housekeeper that we had in our apartment back home was Guajira, right? And she was from like a very particular, like, indigenous tribe. And we just didn't think about that. Like, I didn't process that, right? So it's just, we're very different, and we all come from very different backgrounds. Some of the, like, political, socioeconomic, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. And so you can't just grab, like, the American lens and apply it to Latin America. And I think to the extent of that also, I would ask my American friends to stop overstating the influence that America has on Latin American politics. Everything, a fly does not move in Latin America if the CIA didn't will it to, according to a lot of my American friends. And I'm like, well, that's frankly just not true. But I think that would be the biggest thing that I would want people to sort of acknowledge.
This is great. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. It's just funny. All right. Well, let's wrap up with a subject where I think there can be some unconditional affirmation here, which is food. And I'm going to start with so the question is, talk about, like, either your favorite food or, like, a food that's close to your heart for reasons related to all the stuff we've been talking about. And so I want to start with I had oh my gosh, it was so great, the delight to go to Mexico City last month. And I went to this place called Cocina Oaxaca, and it was just one of the best meals I've ever had in my life. Literally, like, might be the best. I don't know. I'm not a person who, like, really keeps a record, but, like, man, it was amazing. And I want to go back to Mexico for many reasons, but, like, I want to go specifically to Oaxaca because what I had was, so I have had mole a variety of times in the US, and I've been like, it's fine. Like, I like, other stuff better, whatever. But Oaxaca is apparently known as the land of 1,000 moles. Monica, you probably know this, but I didn't. And so I had like 4 different kinds of mole, all of which were incredible. And they were, like, sweet and spicy and interesting. And like, and when I say spicy, I can't handle much spice heat, like picante, that kind of heat. I can't do it. Peppers, but, like, all the different spices, like, there was, anyway, I just, and there are powdered ones and pastes, and it just totally blew my mind. So I'm really into mole, officially as of a month ago. Daniel, food. Tell me about food.
Yes. So I'm going to have to confess, and I lied about how united Hispanics are, because what I'm about to say will probably cause great division amongst the Latin American community, and could probably host a multi-hour Bravery Angels debate in and of itself. But my, like, favorite food, just like if I could only eat one thing for the rest of my life, would be arepas. And what's so divisive about this is that I'm going to claim that they are Venezuelan and not Colombian. And the reason I'm claiming that, and I have to be specific about that, is because Disney tried to say it was otherwise. In the movie Encanto, they were like, oh, the Colombian arepas. And I'm like, no, they're Venezuelan. And everybody will agree. And the Venezuelan ones are better regardless. But I think that would be it. I mean, I still eat Venezuelan arepas constantly. I will bulk order on Amazon, like, the flour so that I can make them. There's a Venezuelan restaurant here in DC that serves arepas that I go to religiously. It's kind of embarrassing now, but I think every first date I've had on DC has been there. And it probably speaks as to why I'm still single. And it's the fact that like, I'm not thinking about the date. I'm just looking for an excuse to go there and eat Venezuelan food. But yeah, I think that would be the one thing. Just Venezuelan arepas, phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like stuff them with anything. They're great. They're awesome. And they're Venezuelan, not Colombian.
Understood. This is how I feel about barbecue. Yeah, it's food is uniting, except if you're talking about barbecue. Anyway, yes. Daniel, I'm gonna have to get you to tell me what that restaurant is, because I haven't been and I have to go and learn why Venezuelan arepas are better than Colombian or other arepas. But yeah, Monica, take us home. What's food? Go.
So I'll bridge divides here and give condiments that are easily available here, but are more kind of Mexican, at least for me. One is tajin. If anyone has seen the seasoning called tajin, didn't used to exist in every grocery store. Now it does. You haven't had corn on the cob unless you've had it with mayonnaise and tajin, mayonesa y tajin, or cotija cheese. Tajin has lime juice and chili pepper kind of stuff, and it's delicious. And I had it all the time as a kid, and now it's like, you can find it anywhere. It's amazing. And the other is crema mexicana, which is way better than sour cream. It's sour cream, but milky and so much more delicious. Cannot tell you. Every baked potato is made better with crema mexicana instead of sour cream. Again, just go to that section of your grocer. It is worth it. You'll never look back.
I love it. See, man, just the food alone makes all this worth it. Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And thank you also to our listeners. You know, you can look forward to more episodes featuring these voices and those from other communities. And, you know, if you're not already a member of Braver Angels, especially today, if you identify as Latin in any form, we want you. We need you. We can't do this without you. And but so for everybody, if you're not yet a member, braverangels.org. Just go to that website. You can join real easy. I think it's like $12 is the cheapest one. And yeah, this is really important work, and we can't do it without you. So, and then for all of anybody who is not already, and I trust you are, I trust you listeners that you're all liking and subscribing and following everything very closely. But if you're not, do those things too. We like being followed. We like being liked. It's just how we feel about it. So yeah, thank you so much. And Daniel and Monica, thank you for being with us today. And yeah, let's get out there and build a house united. Let's do it. Let's get out there and build a house united. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.